designers, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to show you the difference between bias tape and a bias tape maker. Let's get into this. Alright, let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is the different types of bias tape. This one is already made and is a 1/2 inch. Then you have this one. This one is also already made and is a 1/2 inch. Next, we have a bias tape maker where you can make your own bias tape with different types of fabric. When you're sewing bias tape, you have to remember some companies make one side smaller than the other, and that's to catch the fabric in the back. So when you're sewing it open, you take the smaller side first, and the longer side is flipped over to the back. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here is a piece of fabric. And there's two ways to sew bias tape, open or closed. So let's say you want to open it. Now you have to use the smaller side to sew it. So you sew in the crease and then you flip it over. Once you flip it over, the long side is going to be in the back. So it's going to catch the thread when you're sewing it. If you do it the opposite way, it won't work. You can also sew it like this. You can stuff in the fabric and sew it. Now, the only reason why you can do this is because the lines are straight or you have small curves. If your curves are big and you have angles, you cannot sew it closed. You have to open it. Now let's talk about the binding. When you open it, let's say you want to sew it open. This part right here is 3/8 and this part right here is a 1/2 inch. Remember, one is smaller than the other. With this company, for some reason, they make it that way. They say it's a 1/2 inch. It is a 1/2 inch if you stuff it in and sew it. But if you're sewing it open, you have to sew it on the small side, right? So that would be 3/8. It will not work if your seam allowance is a 1/2 inch because that small piece right there is 3/8. If you sew it, it will be less than your seam allowance. So you will either have to stuff it in if it's a straight line or a small curve. If the curves are big or you have angles, you would have to open it, and you can't unless you change your pattern seam allowance. Here is an example. This is one of my designs. I will not be able to stuff the bias tape on the bottom because I want the point to be sharp. So I will have to open it to sew it. The only time that I use the white package is when I make a casing for boning. This is one of my corsets that I made. As you can see, they come in different colors. I put the casing outside for design and then put the boning inside. Let's talk about this one. These are not in a package. They are from different companies and they sell them on Etsy, eBay, and Amazon. They come in different sizes. This one is a 1/2 inch on both sides. Then there's some that are 3/8 on both sides. You could use this if you have a seam allowance that's a 1/2 inch. Because this right here is a 1/2 inch, and when you turn it around, it will be a 1/2 inch too. So you could either open it to sew it or stuff it in if your design is just straight lines or small curves. Now let's get into this bias tape maker. This is a 1-inch clover bias tape maker. With this tool, you can make your own. It makes a 1/2 inch bias tape. Where is the bias on the fabric? Let me show you. We have a piece of cotton fabric right here. And right here is the selvage. This is the straight grain. And this is the cross grain. The cross grain stretches a little bit. Straight grain doesn't stretch at all. The cross grain is what we put around our bodies. And this right here is the bias. It's a 45-degree angle. See how it stretches more than the cross grain? So when you're cutting it, you have to cut it on the bias. What you do is you basically turn the fabric like this and you cut right here. See how it stretches? I'm going to show you how to do it now. To cut bias tape, you will need a self-healing mat and a rotary cutter. When you cut on the mat, it doesn't go through. Most of the healing mats already have the 45-degree on it. As you can see, we have the 60-degree here, the 45 here, and the 30 here. There are different ways to cut the fabric. Here is one way. You can put the fabric on the mat and cut it on a 45-degree line right here. Here is another way to cut it. You take the fabric and you turn it this way on a 45-degree angle. This is your 45 right here. See how it stretches? People usually do it this way when they want to cut a few pieces at once. Question: how much fabric do I cut on the bias for a 1-inch clover maker? The answer is 2 1/8, and it has to be exact. If you cut it 2 inches like I did years ago, you will have one side of the bias tape small, and it won't work if you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance on your clothing. It will only work if you're going to just stuff the fabric in that has straight lines or small curves. I'm going to show you how to cut this now. This part right here is folded, so you have to cut a little piece off in order for you to start. Now that we cut it, we're going to cut the 2 1/8. See how it stretches? That's the bias right there. If you have a ruler that is not wide enough, you can always add the inches. For an example, this ruler right here is 2 inches wide, but I need 2 1/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the lines of the 2 inches and then add the 1/8. Here is the 2 inches. Now you're going to add the 1/8. This is your 1/8. Now you're just going to line them up. And now you have a bias tape that's 2 1/8. You can check it like this. That 1/8 really does make a difference. If you don't do that, your bias tape will not be a 1/2 inch on both sides. Here is the measurements to cut the fabric. You can also get it on my Instagram page, so you can save it just in case you need it one day. To use the bias maker, you just put the fabric inside. If it can't fit, you just get a pin to push it through, like this. Then pull the fabric and iron it down. Some people use this. I hardly use it because I like to steam it down. I feel like steaming it is better because it lays it down nicely. So you push the tool away from the fabric and then you steam it down like this. So now each side is a 1/2 inch. Let's get into the tools. There's different ways to sew this. You can just stuff the fabric in, or you can use some tools to help you. Some people use this, and if you don't have this, you can use a piece of poster board. It's really the same thing. Let me show you how to use it. The length of this can be any length, but the width has to be 2 inches because the bias measurement is 2 1/8. It has to be a little less than the bias measurement so it can move. Some people say they don't know how to use this, and truthfully, at one point I didn't either, until I figured it out years ago. So let me show you how it's done. You just stuff the fabric in here. This screw makes your bias tape fit good. You just move it to make some space for the size of bias tape you're using. The first thing you're going to want to do is clip everything. Stuff your fabric in and clip before you put the tool in. Once you have it clipped, now we can put the tool. This is how you do it. Take the bias tape and pull it through the tool like this. Once you do that, the next thing you're going to do is stuff the fabric inside and bring it up to the front of the bias tape. Once everything looks good, then we can move on to the next step. This knob right here is basically to control the needle position. You turn it so it fits where it needs to be. You don't want to sew too close to the edge of the fabric because it will mess up when you're sewing. Now the bottom is to control the size of the bias tape. You don't want the bias tape to be moving around. So it just makes it a little tighter so that it's in place. Let's sew this. When you're sewing it, you have to lift the fabric up. Don't leave the fabric flat on the sewing machine. I realize that's the reason why it messes up. You learn that through trial and error. When you are a self-taught designer, you have to figure out some things on your own. So lift it up like this. Take your time, because a lot of us don't like the seam ripper. The seam ripper is not our friend. If you mess up, you will have to use the seam ripper and do it all over again. And nobody, and I mean not a single soul, has time for that. To use this tool, you have to have patience and time. And honestly, I don't have none. So I don't really use this method, but I wanted to show you just in case you want to try it. It's always good to try different things to see what you're more comfortable with when you're sewing. Everybody sews differently, different techniques, and that's good because we all learn from each other. Here is the front and the back. Next is the poster board method. I use this method and I also use the stuffing method most of the time. This is what you do. You put the ruler on a 3/8 inch mark and follow that line to tape the poster board. Next, put in the fabric and check to see if the needle is in the right place. Also, press on this lightly because if you press on it hard, it won't move. When I'm sewing, I always have extra bias tape hanging in the front so that I can pull the bias tape better when I'm sewing it. That's one of my techniques that I like to use. This is the front and the back. Both methods look good, but if I had to choose, I would use the poster board. It's less of a hassle. Hopefully this helps you understand more about different types of bias tape and how to sew them. If you want to know how to make a bust cage, here is a video and I will see you in the next one. Don't forget to practice, practice, practice. Bye, designers.